I'm Mandy El-Sayegh. I'm an interdisciplinary artist that works between sculpture, collage, performance, and painting. The title of the exhibition at Space K is For Theresa. I guess the artistic impulse comes from fear, partly, and a need to build out or extend the language through aesthetics of things that I feel are obfuscated in history. I guess the artistic impulse feels like an urgent one. It feels like it comes from this place of scarcity, even though my output is about abundance of material, lots of entry points. It comes from this fear of erasure and wanting to preserve a type of history in a medium that can be looked after. So if I kind of smuggle in those fragments and put it in a dominant tongue, it can be looked after, and then all the things that make it inflammatory or painful are almost looked over in its first run, and then historically it can be excavated. That's the hope. So it's about preservation. I thought For Theresa sounded nice because it reminds me of the preface to a book that often says like for my mother, for my father, and For Theresa refers to Theresa Hakyungcha, a trilingual Korean-American writer, artist, poet, who's very much an artist, very well loved, who died a tragic death at 33, so too soon, but her legacy great and wide spanning. So it's like a love note to her. So obviously speaking to the country that I'm showing the show in, and its histories and its brokenness, because you know a lot of her work is about apprehending and treating the fragment as the kind of starting point of her work. So I think anyone that is a migrant understands that this brokenness in the language, the broken English, extends to your body, extends to your subjectivity, and actually that's where all artists make from, being on the borders of different things and that language not being fully built out. And her bravery in embracing all the voids, if you read any of her poetry, it's all about the broken syntax, about punctuation, that's like where the rules are thrown off. I almost treat text the same way I treat color. So I think a fragment of text has a type of weight or density the same way you'd compose a painting. And because I want to usher in and smuggle in historical documents, it has to almost have some kind of lineage and have a history attached to it. So it's this need to want to Trojan horse certain things. And then my challenge is to let that sit with a material painting field. So we got like the map of Korea here from Japanese propaganda. And this one here, which has a dead baby when the dead baby war started. It's from a newspaper, right-wing newspaper. And I framed it because I was thinking what is more powerful or just as powerful is the frame of the square. And that's all that art is. Art just frames. So it's like, even though we have all this pulp of information, it's a way of like making it sit in place, stay in place. So then it gets kind of, has a transparency here, and it sits with this type of orange that has become part of the palette of the show. So we're fighting, like source materials fighting with an aesthetic field. The challenge is to make that sit harmoniously. So this orange is coming from, like, you know, Buddhist temples. So this very rich tangerine with the gold, but then having these quite painful artifacts lying in the same plane. I guess why text is just as important as, more important, or it's same important as like pigment, because it needs to get into the gallery. And I don't think I can get it into the gallery as a protest sign. The first painting that was done for the show is a very diffuse, harmonious, even, almost like traditional grid that I started off from, which is just like white and quite pale, but it has like hidden in it the Palestine silhouette. And you wouldn't know that unless you have seen this video. I don't think unless I said it, you could see it. It's not recognizable as a shape. Since like 2023, people know the shape of us. But I think before that, people didn't even know the shape of that. The fact that we just exist as a sliver is so Theresa in a way, because she talks about visceral nature of language. And yeah, because again, that is about preserving this like very much love gesture that normally would be thrown away, because my dad would practice his Arabic calligraphy at his desk on these tabloid newspapers to no care what the kind of thing is and throw it away. And I'd want to preserve the action of it. So it's about lovingly holding him, like for my mother, for my father in the beginning of the book. It's the same kind of impulse. So there's a section in the exhibition that's called Psychic Self-Defense, and it's born out of, after October 2023, I obviously had some crisis because my father is from Gaza. It created a cut in the way I understood my practice. So I found it difficult to continue making in the way that I had previously done. I started writing, and the act of writing, there's one up there that I started from that era, No Aesthetic Without My Freedom, which is taken from Mahmoud Darwish and from one of his interviews. And actually subsequently it's been used by another group of artists for a show that was then censored in New York. This treatment of the fragment as powerful kind of markers of solidarity, because again, like Theresa, Mahmoud Darwish was like trilingual, and a lot of the classical poets didn't like his work because he was like violating the grammar of language. But that's what poetry is, that's what art is. So in Psychic Self-Defense, the section before the back of the exhibition, we have work from that era of time where I was making these banner fragments, and they were like taken from these loved writers, Frantz Fanon, Mahmoud, and then sometimes mistranslations of them on these latex skinned works. So I've added to this and built upon this for the show. So I've taken certain phrases from Dictée, blood as record, blood as document, which I really like because that speaks to the kind of protest slogans that I was looking at the time as well, of to bear witness, which was actually held up by someone. And this idea of bearing witness through material, through matter, through the splatter, through brain splatter, through shrapnel. And she always spoke of that. Red Has Ever Been is a famous fragment of hers. And I really like that. It's like we are nowhere in the document, an official document. You know, Palestine is always erased, but we are everywhere in our brain matter and our blood splatter. And literally you have to walk over our corpses. You know, and I kind of think that's so horrifying, but there's something that we all have bodies and we're all susceptible to damage, and that however much you close your ears, however much you close your eyes, you're stepping on that. So another fragment is just her simply saying, I want you to speak, and she's repeated that multiple times. I know we've translated that into Korean. The original book wasn't in Korean. So again, it's like layers and layers of screens of mistranslations of translations. I think it comes just from my very spectrum thinking. So everything is quite literal in my brain, and I think of everything in layers. So this piece that we're looking at, there's like a blood layer, and the kind of white lotion is like the utmost top layer, but we have blues and reds, deoxygenated blood and the oxygenated blood, and then you have like the tissue, which might be the image. And so you're kind of building up a thickness of flesh through the painting itself. So I like to think there's a consequence to a surface. So my interest in abstraction is like, how can you get to abstraction through a very extreme embodied process? So it's not necessarily figuration, but a very fleshy material, a very fleshy process of acknowledging our own mortality. So the word suturing itself is actually from Lacanian psychoanalysis. To suture is like almost like a treatment of language. So again, it speaks to this very visceral methodology that Theresa has. The latex is just the perfect material if we want to talk about suture. My mum was a midwife, so she'd always bring back this medical ephemera. So like the gloves, the catheters, the tubes, they're all plasticky and rubbery and skin-like. And so this thing is like tied to us. My dad has a permanent catheter on his chest, and he always talks about the lines. So again, that speaks to this literal, that's poetic but not. When his lines are gone wrong, he could die. So the lines in a painting are not just lines, you know, they like refer to real things. Again, very spectrumy, thinking of a literal body that I'm making and piecing together. So I guess this is just like a poetic coincidence. My mum would farm this stuff that is quite a massive material for import-export, even though of late they're more synthetic forms. It's preserving and decaying at the same time. It has a thickness to it. It has something that resonates with your own body. It's a natural substance, and it kind of resembles the flesh. So if you think about, you know, Jurassic Park and the amber that held the kind of insects in there, how it, like, I think of that. I think of like, we're keeping these things inside in a fossilized form, but also it's quite absurd and stupid because it's not the most archival material. So I almost treat paint in the same way. I kind of let it, I hope for the best, you know? So there is a conscious process of picking these fragments, as I've shown you a few, but then I kind of let them live in the same room, on the same plane, and hope for the best. I don't know how opaque that's gonna be. I don't know how the red is gonna interact with this, and I might even just layer upon a grid where we lose the whole thing. And then right at the end, I might see it and there's a shape that's formed, an unconscious shape, you know? So it's just an interaction of all these source material and seeing how they play. I don't have like specific things like I collect this, I collect currency, or I collect whatever. But I realized that I just collect whatever I like, which can be like things you'd put in the bin, you know, just because I like the kind of design of that packaging. So it'd be anything that resonates with my kind of past in any form. We got like a corner there of the studio, which I have like paraphernalia and things ripped out of magazines, have equal weight to like this more precious things that are given to me. And they're like gold Buddhist seals. And I think they have like mantras on them. And so like that helped me actually process the whole, on the visual plane, the censorship. So I'd like cover up the news with it because I wasn't allowed to kind of like show the things I wanted to show. So you look at the gold square there, and behind it is like the kafir in abstracted form. So those became a body of work called burning squares, because obviously this joss paper is for burning to acknowledge the dead, and there's very little rights for us and even less for the dead, and in death there's no peace, which is really anguishing. So the collection doesn't have any rhyme or reason, but maybe an outsider would be able to kind of give loose connections. Like I would say the library is composed of atlases, mainly atlases, art books, psychoanalysis, and medical books. Like those are kind of my main areas. My mum was a midwife, my dad, the chronic illness. He was a calligrapher as an artist, so medicine, moving, you know, cartography. The things I collect are loosely around that. But there's also really bizarre things like people's hair that I love and things like that. I guess that's the body section. You know, when you ask anyone of their artistic intention, it's probably the real intention eludes them, you know, evades us, but someone else could probably make a note on it. But maps for me are like about this kind of seeming voice of authority through a kind of depiction. It's about the division of power, and they're not real. If you ever seen that in the body books, the map of the body, if we were to do it based on the nerves, and it has like this homunculus with a massive dick and a big nose and big hands, and everything else is tiny, because it's showing the kind of density of nerves. So it's like, that's a map, but what we're used to is a cross-section with our intestines all neatly ordered. But I've done like cadaver dissection, and actually the reality when you cut up a body is like density of connective tissue that is in between every organ. So the reality and its depiction, so it's about that disjunct. So maps are a total, really represent that kind of gap, and it shows like a formality that has an authority, and Theresa speaks about that authoritative voice that is always kind of like a parasite in the subject, but nonetheless orders everything in our consensual reality. And right now, consensus reality is horrifying. So on a formal level, I wanted a form that like amorphous and has like ununiform edges, so it can form the base of a bruise underneath the priming. So I thought if I get the continents, they could almost form like parts of the tissue in states of injury. So if I lay it upon the continents, it could form that for me, and then I'd eventually lose it. And then whatever would pop up would be the most recognizable dominant shape. So we know the shape of the UK, but I wonder if you live in India, how much you know the shape of the UK if you had to draw it. I mean, draw America. Americans could probably do it better than us, right? So this thing of what stays in our psyche as a recognition form is a big question for me. And I've always worked in big spaces, but never something that tall. I think there's a really beautiful spiritual kind of like aura in that space, and that show kind of reflected that. So I thought how I could work with that. So we thought about different sections which represent different parts in the practice. Having that space to show these different methods in the practice itself seems like something to work with architecturally and splitting it up, and then also working with the height as a big kind of like epic mural, which are actually paintings in states of being made. Different types of floors, different types of surfaces. So we have a lot of skin to envelop the space in. So when you enter the space, you'll see my archetypal grids, which I guess are the most abstract. And then as you kind of advance into the depths of the exhibition, you can see more and more how that is made. So we start from the most abstract and we go into a more kind of figurative space, let's say. So then we move through the psychical self-defense, which is the protest section, which is adjoining a library section. I guess mirroring the Chicory Korean folk tradition of drawing screens in the library form, which is a really nice thing because it's like it has a flatness to it, and abstract art has that. And so we've kind of like replicated a part of a library, because I think the archive is a really important part of the paintings, because the paintings are archival in terms of what they're looking at. But also to like let the audience kind of like sit a bit longer, because you do have a psychology when you enter in a painting show where you're like, okay, I've seen it, and you kind of like walk in and walk out. I'd love the audience to kind of like sit longer with, to bear witness with, in a different way that isn't reactionary, but is meditative, in a way that to be with, in a human way, you know. And then we go through the library and psychical self-defense section into the kind of the bigger section, which has a blood floor and shows the paintings and the kind of censored works, and then the mapping system on the very far back wall. Yeah, the use of the hangul speaks to that kind of moment of like preservation, and how those are like part of national treasures, those artifacts, those documents. So thinking about like identity, loss of identity, and this kind of slippage and change, I guess is really important. That fragment I took from Theresa Hakyung Cha, which says, you smell filtered, edited through westernization. I think art is a part of that system. So a lot of like Asian, East Asian traditions, they have like a hyper-modernized reality and an old ancient shamanic tradition, and never the two shall meet. Same in Thailand, where the artists who paint the temples are not the same. They're artisans, and artists, contemporary artists, are separate. And it's almost like this duality becomes part of my own discourse making. Because when I show in an Asian region, I think there's this kind of unsaid desire for me to perform a Western import. I'm always like wanting to show what is being negated, in a sense. So like the burning squares, these rich tones favored instead of like a more muted, elegant, clean palette, which is what you're greeted by initially. And it gets more and more saturated as you go in. So wanting to acknowledge all the layers of history, all the density, all that kind of like very distinct presence and how they kind of coexist. It's not saying like one is better than the other, you know, because otherwise you'd be exoticizing yourself. It's just showing how these things are existing together all the time and how they interact and not being so separated, how they influence each other. Again, all the source material in the dictate book, she has old with the new. And then there's this ever-evolving language that is like a mutation of all the different things. I did an interview recently, and this phrase stuck with me, where the interviewer was referring to this image of the dead baby square, and she said that there's this kind of reluctance to let go, or a persistence of an image throughout a show, and this thing of holding in place. So I think the slowness of painting allows things to be held in place and to kind of like, I would love the audience to be with, to sit with, which is another form of bearing witness in an aesthetic field that is at once confrontational but allows space, which is something that can't be said for what is happening now. There's this oversaturation which allows us to disassociate. So it's to create a space which you can sit in and want to. So like even we have the library space, which is a literal being with and reading and you're invited to, but also to harmoniously compose a show as if it were a painting and have it something that kind of is elevated can allow for that space too. So letting aesthetics do that work.